The year is 2173, and students of global history are gathering for their advanced seminar on what scholars now call the Great Transition. Looking back at the early 21st century, historians recognize it as one of the most consequential power transitions in human history, rivaling the fall of Rome or the Industrial Revolution in its impact on human civilization. In the halls of power, the United States, which had dominated global affairs since World War II, saw its share of global GDP decline from 30% in the year 2000 to just 24% by 2019. Meanwhile, China's economic might grew exponentially, rising from 4% to over 16% of global GDP in the same period. But raw economic numbers tell only part of the story. The true transition played out across multiple domains. Artificial intelligence labs in Silicon Valley, racing against their counterparts in Beijing. Private space companies launching more rockets than entire nations. And a new kind of arms race. Not for nuclear weapons, but for control of semiconductor manufacturing and 5G infrastructure. What makes this period so fascinating to us future historians is not just the shift in traditional measures of power, but the fundamental transformation in how power itself was exercised. The tools of influence had changed. Aircraft carriers and nuclear stockpiles still mattered, but increasingly, power flowed through data centers, technology patents, and control of critical supply chains. As we examine this pivotal era, we'll analyze the key metrics that signaled this massive transition. But more importantly, we'll try to understand how this reshaping of global power changed the very nature of international relations and set the stage for the world we inhabit today. Consider this your invitation to join us as temporal investigators, piecing together the evidence of one of history's greatest power transitions. Like archaeologists carefully brushing away sand to reveal ancient artifacts, we'll examine the data, diplomatic cables, and technological breakthroughs that paint a picture of this extraordinary period. What we discover might just help us understand not only how we got here, but where we might be heading next. At the dawn of the 21st century, power was still measured in familiar terms that would have been recognizable to strategists from decades past. Military bases dotting the globe, massive aircraft carriers patrolling strategic waterways, and nuclear arsenals maintaining an uneasy peace. The United States stood alone at the apex of this traditional power structure. With military bases in over 80 countries and territories, America's global reach was unprecedented in human history. Its 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, each a floating city of 5,000 personnel, dwarfed the capabilities of any other nation. To put this in perspective, while China began developing its naval capabilities, it operated just 2 carriers. Even Russia, inheritor of the Soviet military machine, maintained only a single aging carrier. But military hardware was just one dimension of American dominance. The US dollar reigned supreme in global trade, and American diplomatic influence extended through a web of alliances from NATO in Europe to bilateral security agreements across Asia. This combination of military might, economic strength, and diplomatic relationships created what scholars called the unipolar moment, a rare period in history when a single nation held undisputed primacy. Yet beneath this apparent stability, tectonic shifts were already underway. China's economic miracle was transforming into military might, with defense spending growing at double-digit rates. Russia, despite its diminished status, maintained the world's largest nuclear arsenal alongside the United States, with approximately 6,000 warheads each, a reminder that traditional measures of power couldn't be ignored. Perhaps most telling was the changing nature of military bases and power projection. While the United States maintained its extensive network of overseas bases, a legacy of World War II and the Cold War, China began establishing its first overseas military base in Djibouti in 2017. The role of nuclear deterrence during this period presents a fascinating paradox. While the threat of mutual assured destruction maintained a degree of stability between major powers, it also pushed competition into other domains. A case study in traditional power projection can be found in the Persian Gulf, where U.S. aircraft carriers served as both military assets and diplomatic tools. When tensions rose with Iran, the mere redeployment of a carrier group could signal American resolve without firing a shot. But even as these traditional elements of power remained important, their limitations were becoming apparent. The ability to win conventional battles didn't necessarily translate into achieving political objectives, as seen in protracted conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. The period from 2000 to 2020 thus represents a fascinating transition. The last era when traditional military power could be considered the primary currency of international relations. While aircraft carriers still patrolled the seas and nuclear arsenals remained on alert, new forms of power were emerging that would fundamentally reshape global politics in the decades to come. In the early decades of the 21st century, something unprecedented occurred. Corporations began wielding power that rivaled, and in some cases exceeded, that of traditional nation-states. Consider this striking fact. By 2024, the combined market capitalization of just 5 tech companies, Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Alphabet, and Amazon, reached $14.9 trillion, exceeding the GDP of every G7 nation except the United States. This wasn't just about money. These tech giants were effectively becoming digital sovereigns, governing vast online territories that transcended national borders. They controlled critical infrastructure that billions of people relied on daily, from communication platforms to cloud computing services that powered government operations worldwide. The rise of cyber warfare marked another fundamental shift in the balance of power. Traditional military metrics, like aircraft carriers and tank divisions, suddenly seemed antiquated when a handful of skilled hackers could potentially cripple a nation's power grid or financial system. Microsoft reported that their customers faced more than 600 million cybercriminal and nation-state attacks every day, a scale of conflict that would have been unimaginable in previous eras. Digital sovereignty became a crucial battleground. China's ability to control its domestic internet space through the Great Firewall demonstrated how digital borders could be as significant as physical ones. Meanwhile, the United States' historical dominance of internet infrastructure began to wane, with its share of global internet traffic dropping from a historic high of 70% to less than 23% in recent years. The emergence of cryptocurrency and blockchain technology posed the first serious challenge to state control of monetary systems since the rise of central banking. While traditional financial power had been exercised through institutions like the Federal Reserve or the International Monetary Fund, suddenly, private entities could create their own monetary systems that operated outside state control. Perhaps nothing illustrates this new power dynamic better than the TikTok controversy. Here was a Chinese-owned app that had captured the attention of hundreds of millions of Western users, particularly young people. The ensuing political battle wasn't about military bases or trade routes, but about who would control the digital infrastructure that shaped cultural influence and data flows. Social media platforms became the new battlegrounds for global influence. Instead of sending diplomats or aircraft carriers, nations deployed armies of digital influencers and sophisticated disinformation campaigns. The ability to shape narratives and influence public opinion through these platforms became as crucial as traditional forms of statecraft. The semiconductor industry emerged as another critical front in this digital power struggle. Taiwan's dominance in advanced chip manufacturing, controlling 68% of the global market in 2023, turned the small island nation into a linchpin of global power politics. Access to these vital components became as strategically important as oil was in the 20th century. What made this digital revolution particularly transformative was how it upended traditional power hierarchies. A company like SpaceX could launch more rockets into orbit than most nations. Social media platforms could amplify or suppress political movements more effectively than traditional state propaganda. And digital payment systems could potentially bypass the international banking system that had been a key tool of American power. This new landscape created novel vulnerabilities and opportunities. Nations that had lagged in traditional measures of power could suddenly leap forward through technological advancement. Meanwhile, even the most powerful military forces found themselves grappling with threats from non-state actors wielding sophisticated digital weapons. The digital revolution didn't just add a new dimension to global power. It fundamentally rewrote the rules of how power was accumulated, projected, and maintained. In doing so, it set the stage for a profound realignment of global influence that would shape the rest of the 21st century. By 2020, traditional measures of power like GDP and military spending began to seem almost quaint compared to the new currencies of global influence. Instead, nations increasingly competed across a complex matrix of technological, informational, and environmental metrics that would have seemed alien to 20th century strategists. Consider semiconductors, those tiny chips that power everything from smartphones to military systems. Taiwan's dominance in advanced chip manufacturing, controlling 68% of global production in 2023, made it more strategically valuable than many nations with larger armies or economies. This reality sparked a fierce competition among major powers, with the United States investing billions to increase its share from 12% to a projected 17% by 2027. The race for technological independence became a defining feature of this era. China's Belt and Road Initiative, which drove bilateral trade worth over $7.8 trillion between 2013 and 2019, wasn't just about building ports and railways. It was about creating alternative technological ecosystems free from Western control. Meanwhile, patent ownership became as crucial as territorial ownership, with companies like Siemens AG controlling nearly 30% of global renewable energy technology patents. Space exploration underwent a remarkable transformation from government-led prestige projects to critical infrastructure for global power. Private companies launched more rockets than state agencies, with SpaceX alone planning 124 launches in 2024, more than all government space agencies combined. The artificial intelligence race emerged as perhaps the most critical battleground. Nations that could develop and deploy advanced AI systems gained unprecedented advantages in economic productivity, military capability, and social control. This wasn't just about raw computing power, it was about who could harness the massive datasets needed to train these systems. China's advantage in data collection, thanks to its large population and comprehensive surveillance systems, became a crucial strategic asset. Environmental technology leadership emerged as an unexpected source of global influence. As climate change intensified, nations that controlled green technology patents and supply chains for renewable energy components gained significant leverage over others. The ability to produce and deploy clean energy technology became as strategically important as oil production was in the previous century. In this new landscape, the metrics of power shifted dramatically. Nations were increasingly evaluated not by the size of their armies, but by metrics such as control over critical technology, supply chains, number of AI patents and research breakthroughs, quantum computing development, space launch capabilities and satellite networks, renewable energy technology ownership, data collection, and processing capabilities. Perhaps most telling was the transformation in how diplomatic influence was exercised. When China wanted to extend its influence in Africa between 2020 and 2024, it didn't just build military bases. It established digital infrastructure, deployed AI systems, and offered technology transfer agreements. This comprehensive approach to power projection proved more effective than traditional military or economic pressure. The environmental dimension added another layer of complexity. Nations that led in green technology development gained not just economic advantages, but moral authority in global affairs. By 2040, it had become clear that power in the international system could no longer be measured by simple metrics like military spending or GDP. Instead, nations had to compete across a complex web of technological, informational, and environmental domains. This transformation didn't mean traditional power became irrelevant. Aircraft carriers and nuclear weapons still mattered, but they became just one element in a much more complex equation of global influence. The most successful nations were those that could effectively combine these traditional elements with mastery of the new metrics of power. The transformation of global power structures in the early 21st century wasn't just about the rise and fall of individual nations. It was about the emergence of new forms of collective power and strategic alignment that would have been unimaginable in previous eras. In 2024, the Alliance conducted its largest exercise since the Cold War, Steadfast Defender, involving over 90,000 forces, more than 50 ships, and more than 80 aircraft from all 32 NATO members. But this wasn't your grandfather's NATO focused solely on military deterrence. The Alliance had evolved to address hybrid threats, cyber warfare, and even climate security, recognizing that 21st century challenges required more than just military responses. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, evolved from a regional security arrangement into a comprehensive economic and technological partnership. These new alliances weren't based solely on military cooperation, but on shared technological ecosystems, data governance frameworks, and supply chain integration. Perhaps the most significant development was the rise of the Global South as a coherent power bloc. Rather than simply aligning with either the US or China, nations in Africa, Latin America, and South Asia began exercising collective influence through strategic non-alignment. This wasn't the non-alignment of the Cold War era. It was a sophisticated balancing act that allowed these nations to extract maximum benefits from competing power centers. The ASEAN bloc provides a masterclass in how smaller nations maintained autonomy in this new environment. Despite being caught between the competing influences of China and the United States, ASEAN nations deftly balanced these relationships while building their own collective strength. Voting patterns in the UN General Assembly revealed this shifting dynamic. China found increasing alignment with developing nations, while the US frequently found itself in the minority on key votes. The Belt and Road Initiative evolved beyond infrastructure development into a complex web of technological standards, digital payment systems, and data governance frameworks. Meanwhile, competing initiatives like the Build Back Better World (B3W) partnership offered alternative models of development and connectivity. Unlike the relatively straightforward military alliances of the past, these new blocs integrated technology standards and digital infrastructure, supply chain coordination, environmental cooperation, cultural and educational exchanges, joint research and development initiatives, shared data governance frameworks. Small and medium-sized powers learned to play these various alliance systems against each other. When Vietnam wanted to develop its digital infrastructure, it deliberately balanced Chinese technology with Western alternatives. The result was a more complex, but also more resilient international system. Instead of a simple bipolar or unipolar world, what emerged was a web of overlapping alliances and partnerships that defied traditional categorization. Success wasn't just about military might or economic power. It was about the ability to navigate multiple alliance systems simultaneously, to leverage technological interdependencies, and to build coalitions around specific issues rather than permanent blocs. By examining these evolving alliance systems, we can see how the very nature of international cooperation and competition was transformed. The result wasn't just a redistribution of power, it was a fundamental reimagining of how nations could work together to achieve their objectives in an increasingly complex world. While historians and strategists focused on traditional metrics of power, a series of unexpected developments fundamentally reshaped the global order in ways that few had anticipated. These weren't the carefully planned moves of nation-states, but rather transformative forces that emerged from the intersection of technology, environmental change, and private enterprise. The climate crisis emerged as perhaps the most powerful force reshaping international relations. Nations that had invested heavily in renewable energy technology suddenly found themselves with unexpected leverage. By 2024, companies like Siemens AG and General Electric controlled nearly 55% of global renewable energy patents between them. This technological advantage translated directly into diplomatic power as nations scrambled to decarbonize their economies. Space exploration underwent a remarkable privatization that transformed geopolitics. In 2024, private companies conducted more launches than all government space agencies combined, with SpaceX alone planning 124 launches. Private companies effectively became sovereign actors in space, influencing everything from global communications to military surveillance capabilities. The quantum computing race delivered perhaps the most dramatic upheaval. The ability to break current encryption methods threatened to render traditional cybersecurity measures obsolete overnight. Nations that had built their security infrastructure around classical encryption faced a stark choice: achieve quantum supremacy or risk having their most sensitive communications exposed. This wasn't just about military secrets. It was about the security of financial systems, diplomatic communications, and critical infrastructure. Biotechnology advances created entirely new dimensions of power. The ability to edit genes, create synthetic organisms, and develop novel medical treatments became as strategically important as traditional military capabilities. By 2024, AI systems were processing vast amounts of data to identify patterns in international relations that human analysts might miss. The ability to predict and model complex global interactions gave nations with advanced AI capabilities a significant advantage in diplomatic negotiations. Some countries even began experimenting with AI-assisted decision-making in foreign policy, fundamentally changing how diplomatic strategies were developed. These unexpected developments created new vulnerabilities and opportunities that traditional power metrics failed to capture. Nations with advanced quantum computing could potentially render others' military secrets transparent. Private space companies could deny or grant access to crucial satellite infrastructure. Leaders in biotechnology could influence global health policies, and advanced AI systems could predict and shape diplomatic outcomes in unprecedented ways. The rise of private actors in these domains complicated traditional state-to-state relations. Companies like SpaceX weren't just contractors, they were becoming autonomous players in international relations. Environmental leadership became an unexpected source of global influence. Nations that developed effective carbon capture technologies or innovative climate adaptation strategies found themselves with new forms of leverage in international negotiations. These game changers didn't just add new dimensions to international relations, they fundamentally altered how power itself was exercised. Traditional military might or economic strength became just one element in a complex equation that included technological capability, environmental leadership, and control of critical emerging technologies. The most successful nations were those that recognized and adapted to these new realities early. They understood that power in the 21st century wasn't just about aircraft carriers or GDP. It was about mastering these unexpected domains that were reshaping the global order in fundamental and often unpredictable ways. As we conclude our examination of this remarkable period of power transition, we find ourselves not at an ending, but at the beginning of new questions that will shape the decades to come. The transformation we've witnessed, from traditional military might to complex, multidimensional power dynamics, raises profound questions about the future of global order. Consider how rapidly power metrics evolved in just a few decades. From aircraft carriers to AI capabilities, from nuclear arsenals to renewable energy patents, from military bases to quantum computing breakthroughs. The pace of change shows no signs of slowing. The emergence of private entities wielding nation-state levels of power, the rise of new alliance systems that transcend traditional geopolitical boundaries, and the growing importance of technological sovereignty have fundamentally altered how we must think about global stability and power projection. How might the balance of power shift if a new technology emerges that renders nuclear weapons obsolete? Think about how quantum computing breakthroughs could affect military deterrence and global stability. What new forms of deterrence might replace nuclear weapons? What role do you think artificial intelligence will play in diplomatic negotiations by 2050? Consider a world where AI systems can process vast amounts of diplomatic data and predict negotiation outcomes with high accuracy. How would this change the nature of international relations? How would you maintain stability in a world where private companies have more power than medium-sized nations? When SpaceX can launch more rockets than most countries, and tech giants control critical global infrastructure, what new governance frameworks might be needed? If you were leading a small nation today, what strategies would you employ to maintain autonomy in this evolving power landscape? How would you balance relationships with major powers while protecting your nation's interests in an increasingly complex world? As we look to the future, perhaps the most important lesson from this period is that power itself has become more fluid and multidimensional than ever before. Success in this new era requires not just strength in traditional domains, but the ability to adapt to rapidly emerging forms of influence and control. The answers to these questions will shape not just the balance of power, but the very nature of human civilization in the decades to come.